We'd like for you to turn in your New Testaments tonight to the 16th chapter of Luke, and I'd like to read the first paragraph. It's a parable, and I'd like for us to bring our lesson from this passage tonight. Glad we can be together to honor God on a day so many in this world have no idea about what we owe God and the fact that this day belongs to the Lord. And I'm glad you are here, and I'm glad we're here together, and I'm glad that we can honor the Lord in the way that He has described in His Word, that we can please Him, and that we can know we can please Him by what He said in His Word. I believe when we try to teach, we attempt to illustrate things, put parallels, and in that way, if we can take someone and tell them what they already know, use something they already know, and then apply it to some greater principle, then that illustration forms a teaching mechanism. And Jesus did that. The parables are those kinds of mechanisms. Parabole is the Greek word that we get our English word parable, and it means something set down beside of. And so here Jesus would set down a story, and beside of that story was the spiritual meaning. Some have said that a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning, and that's probably a pretty good illustration of it as well. There are a couple of extremes, though, that we can go to when we read parables and then try to teach on them, and one is to make every little detail of the parable mean something. And we look for meanings, perhaps hidden meanings, and we try to extrapolate from those spiritual ideas. That's one thing, to get to read into it more than the Lord intended. And then on the other hand, there is the tendency to gloss over some things that obviously would be intended by the Lord. And to try to strike a happy medium is sometimes a difficult thing. But in most of the parables, the overarching ideas are pretty evident. And those parables that Jesus gave, a large degree of them, deal with the very nature of the kingdom. In the 13th, you don't have to turn here. I've already asked you to turn to Luke 18. But in Luke 16, I'm sorry. But in the 13th chapter of Matthew, when we find Jesus first beginning to speak on using parables, and He gave the parable the sower, the disciples said, "Lord, why speakest thou to the disciples in parables?" And He said, "Unto you it is given to know the mystery of the kingdom, but unto them it is not given." And seeing they see, but they don't understand. Hearing they hear, but they do not perceive. And the reason was because their heart was darkened and their ears were dull of hearing. And Jesus went on to say that your ears are blessed because you have sought. And the idea behind that is, best I can tell, that the parables were intended to give more information, more insight into the nature of the kingdom for those who were truly interested. For those who were not truly interested, it would just be maybe an agricultural or a fishing lesson, something that really didn't mean much to anybody if they weren't looking for it. Hence, Jesus said in some of the parables, let him that hath ears, let him hear. In other words, there's more intended than just a story. Well, in the 16th chapter of Luke, I want us to talk tonight about the parable of the unrighteous steward. And we'll put it in context in just a moment, but this has been a parable that has given some consternation to people who would like to study the Scripture, because it seems like the Lord is commending a person who's in the wrong. And how do you do that? Well, we'll see as we go along. And He said unto the disciples, there was a certain rich man who had a steward. And while we need to understand that here is in kind of the order of things, here might be a master who owns a large estate. And the master has one who is called a steward. And the steward was under the master, but he was over the estate, perhaps over other servants as well. So he was kind of like a middleman. He was under the master, but he was over those of the estate. So a certain rich man who was a steward, had a steward, and the same was accused unto him that he was wasting his goods. He called him and said unto him, What is this that I hear of thee? Render the account of thy stewardship, for thou canst be no longer steward. And the steward said within himself, What shall I do, seeing that my Lord taketh away the stewardship from me? I have not strength to dig, to beg I am ashamed. I'm resolved what to do, that when I'm put out of the stewardship, they may receive me into their houses. And calling to him each one of his Lord's debtors, he said to the first, How much owest thou unto my Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said unto him, Take your bond and sit down quickly and write 50. Just write 50% of what you owe. Then said he to another, How much owest thou? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. He said, Take your bond and write 80, or 80% of what you owe over altogether. And then beginning in verse 8, the Lord begins to make applications to the story he just gave. His Lord commended the unrighteous steward because he had done wisely. Now, just think here for a second. He commended the unfaithful steward who had been wasting his master's goods because he had done wisely. Well, how is that? He explains, For the sons of this world are for their own generation wiser than the sons of the light. Here he saw what was coming, and he knew he had access to one who owed 100, one who owed this or that, and he said, I can extract from them some amount of money to pay what I owe. And so that's what he did. He looked ahead to the day of his reckoning, and he was able to extract from those debtors an amount to satisfy his master. So he said in verse 8, the Lord commended him because he had done wisely, and made the application. The sons of this world, that is worldly minded people who are dealing with worldly people above them and under them, are for their own generation wiser than the sons of the light, wiser than disciples of the Lord in what they're doing. And he further explains it. And I say unto you, make to yourselves friends by means of the mammon of unrighteousness. The NIV says worldly wealth. The word mammon just means a treasure, riches. And he says, make to yourselves friends by means of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when it shall fail, they may receive you into the eternal tabernacles. Let's back up just a second. Here are the friends by means of the mammon of unrighteousness. The friends that he had, as it were these people who owed his master a sum of money. And he was able to take from them to pay his master. Make friends, therefore, by means of the mammon of unrighteousness. Well, in a sense, that's what he had done to those who were under him to pay his master who was over him. But the spiritual application is seen. Make to yourselves friends by means of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when it shall fail, that is, the money is gone, either there is no more, or you have no more need of it because you die, they may receive you into the eternal tabernacles. Well, it was a sense in which the friends could help out this steward, but here the application is made. You use the money that is at your disposal, the resources that you have, you use it wisely. And then when it fails or you die and there's no more need of it, then they may receive you into the eternal tabernacles. Who are the they? Well, the only ones who could receive us into eternal tabernacles would be God and Christ. And so I take that is where the emphasis shifts. Verse 10, he that is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. And he that is unrighteous in a very little is unrighteous also in much. If you're not dealing with the material possessions you have in this life in a wise way, how in the world would you expect the Lord to give you heaven and eternal riches? So he says, If therefore ye have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? That would be heaven and eternal riches. And if ye have not been faithful in that which is another's, that would be like what you're dealing with on a worldly or physical basis, who will give you that which is your own? No servant can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Well, that's a beautiful parable. It has some parts that are somewhat difficult, but I think the overall idea is that how we deal with resources and money we have on earth will reflect how the Lord deals with us in the hereafter. Understanding the context, I believe, helps understand the text. The people addressed go back and go ahead. If you notice in chapter 15, this is a lengthy speech the Lord gave. All of us know chapter 15. There are three parables. But I want you to notice in verses 1 and 2, all the publicans and sinners were drawing near unto him to hear him. And both the Pharisees and scribes murmured, saying, This man receives sinners. Well, you have publicans and sinners who were listening to Jesus, and the religious establishment, the Pharisees and the scribes, were murmuring because they were close by, and Jesus was actually including them. And so what it looks like is that these publicans and sinners had become disciples. Some perhaps would become apostles, but they had changed, and they were listening to the Lord. And then there were the Pharisees and the scribes who were among them. And the overall purpose of these parables, I take in chapter 15, was to condemn the Pharisees' attitudes toward the penitent sinners who were coming to the Lord, such as the tax collectors and these other sinners, and also emphasize God's love for everyone. Here with the 100 sheep, later on in chapter 15, one goes astray, the shepherd goes and gets that. There's rejoicing in heaven. The woman who had 10 coins, and she lost one, and she sweeps her house completely until she finds the one. There's rejoicing in heaven. So you have the 100 sheep, one goes astray. The 10 coins, one is lost. And then you have the 2 sons. One is lost, one is with his father. And so the extended parable with the parable, what we call the prodigal son, is that the younger of the two, he goes out, he spends his father's inheritance on riotous living. His brother said harlots. Eventually, he comes to himself. He sees what a dreaded position he's put himself in. He thinks about his father's house and the hired servants who had bread enough to spare. So he goes back, and as he's coming, his father sees him. His father goes and welcomes him with open arms. The fatted calf is called, the ring is put on his finger, the coat is given him. And then as the dancing and the music is going on, the elder brother hears about that. And he comes in, we might say, pouting. He's somewhat jealous of what's going on. And the father says, look, you've always been with me. You have all these animals. You can kill a fatted calf anytime you want. But this, your brother, was lost, and now he's found. He was dead, and now he's alive. And obviously shows that God is concerned about every last one of us. And that's comforting, isn't it? That every individual is important to God. God loves you. He loves you on an individual basis. And He knows exactly what each one of us is going through in life, and He wants us to overcome. He loves each one of us. And that's one thing Luke's account emphasizes insofar as the emphasis of the humanity of Jesus, that He's a brother to us all. Well, in chapter 16, a portion of which we just read, it looks like that among that crowd of publicans or tax collectors and sinners are some people who had used the unrighteous mammon in a wrong way. They had maybe gained it in an unrighteous way and maybe used it in a wrong way. And now Jesus says, you need to turn what you used to use and what you used to gain in a very shrewd way. You need to turn those principles to serving the Lord and using what you have faithfully to me. And then the 3 parables that follow or in chapter 16, not the parable, but the rich man and Lazarus, as well as in chapter 17, the picture of the man who had servants and was out in the field, I think they're all related. Chapter 16 through 17 emphasize the right use of riches, as we pointed out. What happens when they're not used properly? That's the rich man and Lazarus. And then in chapter 17, even if one has great gifts and great resources and uses them properly, it's impossible for him to do more than his duty. Say we are unprofitable servants, we have done that which it was our duty to do. And so still we're saved by grace through faith, even when we do what we're supposed to do with the resources that we have. Jesus does not commend the fact that these tax collectors had been unjust through life. He doesn't do that. He doesn't do that through the parable of the unjust steward. He commended the unjust steward not in the fact he's just wasting everything, but how he had changed and how he was thinking ahead how he might use those funds that were at his disposal to satisfy the needs that were his master's. So overall, the emphasis of the parable is how shrewdly or cleverly the steward or the manager of his master's estate used his resources to prepare for the future. I think there are some major lessons along this line that we can appreciate. One is that we need to apply the same diligence and shrewdness that we earlier used in worldly interests to spiritual matters. That's at least was the point that he's making with these people, these tax collectors. The kind of forethought that you used in physical matters, you need to apply the same kind of forethought in spiritual matters. And turn the possessions earlier used in unrighteous ways to righteous pursuits. A third thing, I believe, is that often worldly people use more forethought. He says this, that for the sons of this world are, for their generation, wiser than the sons of the light. Worldly people use more forethought in plans dealing with worldly masters above them and dishonest tenants below them than Christians do with God above them and faithful Christians below them. I think all of us can see that there is a sense of being detail-oriented. We want to work out all the details in certain things to make sure every I is crossed and I is dotted rather and T is crossed. And all this is done. And then when it comes to the church, spiritual matters, it's like we just kind of wing it, take it on the fly. And not as much forethought and planning in the future is done. And Jesus says this is what needs to be done. There needs to be a carefulness, just like you apply in money matters, there needs to be a carefulness that you apply to spiritual matters as well. And whether or not we will have eternal riches will be determined by how we use worldly goods now. He makes that abundantly clear in this parable. Well, I want us to think about some specific applications of this just for a minute or two. One is that this unrighteous steward or unjust steward, called in some translations, he planned ahead for his physical welfare. You notice that he's in the 16th chapter, he says, I'm resolved what to do. When I'm put out of the stewardship, I'll call to each one his Lord's debtors. How much do you owe? 100 measures of oil. And then how much do you owe? He said 100 measures of wheat. And write what you, and so in other words, he knew there was going to be an accounting that he was going to have to meet. And he needed to be ready to be able to give what that accounting would demand of him. So he knew there would be an accounting. Well, we know there will be an accounting one of these days. It may be sooner than we realize. All of us are going to one day stand before the judgment seat of Christ, and that will be on the day when the Lord returns. And he will come as a thief in the night when we least expect him. He could come tonight, he could come tomorrow. We don't know that. We don't know when, but the point is emphasized throughout the teaching of Jesus that we need to be prepared, we need to be ready, we need to be right with him at all times. We don't need to bank on the fact that he's going to come 15 years from now, 10 years, I'll sow my wild oats and pray for a crop failure and do all I want to do now, and one of these days in the nick of time, I'll make things right. That is not how God shows we ought to be. He knew there would be a reckoning, and so He planned for it. If we have not obeyed the gospel, and we are accountable, when do you plan to obey the gospel? I was talking to a young fellow that I was teaching in a Bible class years ago, and he had kind of told me what he planned to do with his life and what he wanted to do in school and work. And so I just kind of went through a little series of questions with him, and because I was truly interested in him, and so I called him by name and said, so what do you plan to do the next 4 years? Well, I plan, when I graduate, I want to go to school. I'd like to go to school over here, and he mentioned where, and he said, I plan to study this and I'd like to get my degree in that. I said, well then what? And he said, well, after that, I'd like to move to this, and he gave the city that he'd like to live in, and I'd like to use my area of expertise to work on that. And I said, sounds good. Then what? Well, during the meantime, he said, I'd like to find a girl that would have me and get married and start our lives together. Then what? Well, he said, I would like to buy a house at some point, and then maybe we could have some children. Of course, he didn't even know who his girlfriend was, but I'd like to have, a family. And then I said, well, that's good. And then what? He said, well, I guess time will come, and I'll grow to be kind of middle age, and kids would grow up, and they would get a little bit older, and I'd like to retire at an age where I could enjoy things afterward. Then what? He said, well, I guess I'll get old. And I'm not sure what will happen. I said, then what? He said, I guess, Brother Philip, I'll die. I said, then what? And he had not obeyed the gospel. And what we have to do is get used to thinking down the telescope of time, that we live in the here and the now. But the here and the now is only going to be real brief. And we're going to be next month. It's almost March. Can you believe the third month of 2022 is almost here? That's almost unbelievable to me. I'm hardly have gotten used to writing 2022 on checks. And here we are 3 months into it. And before you know it, it'll be 2023 if the world stands. And we need to plan ahead. Just as he planned ahead for his physical, his financial welfare, we need to plan ahead. What am I doing today that is going to affect me tomorrow and next week and next month and next year spiritually? When I was teaching 9th grade Bible, I taught some 11th grade English for a while, but when I was teaching Bible, usually I was dealing with 14 and 15-year-olds. And at the beginning of school, I like to talk about the decade of transition. And the idea is that here is a decade, 10 years, that you go from roughly 14 or 15 to 24 or 25. And I would tell the kids that, there are so many changes that you're going to be making or probably will make during this span of your life. Most of the time, from the time you're 4 or 5 to 14 or 15, there aren't a lot of changes. You're still living at home. Mom and dad are taking care of you. You don't have really a job that requires a whole lot of you. You're going to school and you're trying to... But from the time you're 14 or 15, likely you'll finish high school. If you go to college, you'll finish that likely. If you don't, you'll be in a job. A lot of people have already married by that time, and a lot of people already have a house. And so you go from this time of dependency on mom and dad to the time where you're really on your own and you're answerable to yourself and perhaps some others, but not necessarily to mom and dad. and habits begin to be formed during those years, and they need to be good habits. And I would usually ask the young, what do you see yourself doing spiritually? And I would have some of the young ladies say, well, I'd like to teach young people. By the time I'm 24, 25, I'd like to be able to teach a young people's class, maybe of children. That's commendable. That's commendable. So then I would follow up, well, what are we doing right now to put ourselves in a position where we can do that on a spiritual level? And what we have to do is just almost as it were project where we would like to be 10 years from now. Well, what am I doing now in order to get to that position then? What am I doing now insofar as my life is concerned, dealing with my finances, dealing with all resources that I might have at my disposal to put myself in a position where heaven is going to be mine, where if you are unfaithful in these riches that are not your own, who is going to commit unto you the true riches? But if you're faithful in a few things, you'll be faithful in many. There's the parallel that the Lord gives. Is it indeed well with our soul? A lot of people like that song. It is well. It's a declaration. It is well with my soul. I hope so. I hope it is with mine. I pray, God, that it is. And I hope it is with you. But people sing that song as if they're very, very confident. I hope that's the case. A second point I want to make is that this unjust steward used the resources available as a steward to satisfy his master over him. We made that point earlier. And what about our money? How do we use our money now? That was the specific use in the parable. He wrote 80, 50% in order to be able to satisfy his master above him. How do we use our money now? Well, if we're younger, oftentimes, or we have our parents helping us, money is spent on school, clothes for school, books, health care is a part of it. Some of us are in athletics and cost for that. Some are in music, it costs for that. So we're spending money in a lot of ways, and that's not necessarily anything wrong at all about that. But then when you compare what we're using for physical things to spiritual, then how does it come up? How does it compare? Do we have a quality Bible? Years ago, when we were living in Athens, there was a family that we were fairly close to, had several children. They were good baseball players, had several boys. And they had the latest in aluminum bats, the latest in a really nice glove, and they had special instructors that they would have. And but the Bible that I knew and I could see was, cheap and falling apart. And when they came to services, it looked like they'd been up all Saturday night. But the mother told me one time, we like to get the boys at the games real early so they can get their mind, she used this phrase, so they can get their mind in it. They can watch other pitchers and kind of get used to the speed of the ball. And I thought, that's good. Get there early and kind of get used to it and talk to some of the people and get your head in the game. You know where that's going. But it seemed like they could never be at services on time. Come in late, come in tired, hair disheveled. It looked like they just got out of bed, no preparation whatsoever. And the point I'm making is, here's an area of desire in a physical, material realm that we want to really do well at. And we're willing to spend a lot of money, and we're willing to go to sacrifices, make sacrifices to go to these extra places to have more instruction. But when it comes to God and the Bible and things that are spiritual and eternal, it never adds up. It never compares favorably to those things. Attendance, the helps, the study aids, all those things are forgotten. And it's a blessing now. I've told you this before, but I'll just repeat it. I spent hundreds of dollars in my 20s, not in $20 bills, but when I was in my 20s, early 20s. If I'd get some money for a birthday or something, or the church was supporting me partially, and I'd save a little bit, and here's a set of books that I thought would really, really be helpful. It was, you know, you had to kind of make the ends meet in order to buy those things. And now you don't even have, they're free. I remember spending about $89 on the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. There are 4 volumes, and I just cherish those books. But you can Google International Standard Bible Encyclopedia, you can go online, you can go to any article you want to. It's free. And we have all of these Bible aids to help us in our understanding of the divine word, and we need to make use of all these things that we have advantage over. God will hold us accountable. When I think sometimes about that, the advantages I have had in listening to what I consider some of the best uninspired preaching that ever was. And I know that's subjective, but I think it was some awfully good preaching. And I think I have had advantages. What have I done with the advantages I've had? This unjust steward had some advantages. He had things at his disposal. What did he do with them? Well, he didn't do much with them. He wasted his master's goods until he found out there was going to be a reckoning, and then he worked wisely. Do we use the same diligence in spiritual pursuits that we do in worldly pursuits? What about punctuality? Would you get to a wedding late? What about a funeral late? What about work late? And what about the church? What about the classes that we have here? And they're coming, and they're people we need to see, people we need to talk with. That passage in Hebrews 10, I think there's a little more involved than just assembling. We are to exhort one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. We're to consider one another, or stimulate one another, the New American Standard says, to love and to good works, not forsaking our own assembly. I think before, after assemblies, during assemblies, through our worship, all of that is involved. And it's my understanding, just like the lady who said, we like to get the kids there early so they can get their minds in the game. And they can watch the other pitchers as they warm up and get the speed of the ball in their mind. And is there something we could do? Is there a translation of that? Where we could talk with people, see how they're doing, what's going on in life, is there something I can do to help? Is there a place we can go to talk about this? This, I think, should be the kind of interaction that we have if we take the same kind of principles in a physical realm and apply them to the spiritual. In planning, teaching, or being taught, the preparation that goes into whatever we do. Brother Gene asked me about leading singing this morning, and I asked Landon, "What are you preaching on?" And he told me, and I like to have a focus in singing. I think it helps me, at least. If it helps others, fine. And for the life of me, I could not think just in that short time what I could do, where we could go with the singing that somehow might coincide with Landon's lesson this morning. So I tried to lead some songs that would just be worshipful. But time taken, planning, where are we going with this? Is there a specific? That's one thing, and I'll just tell you that a lot of churches use the paperless hymnal, where everything is on the overhead, and you have 2 lines, usually an average of 8 words per line. And quite frankly, what has to happen in order to do that, it's almost choreographed. Everything has to be put in the computer before the service starts, and there's no way you can change it. And there are too many things that happen at a worship service that I think leads to the fact it would be better if something were able to be changed, if there was an additional verse, or leave out a verse in a song, a stanza. Or change a song and use a different song if somebody has obeyed the gospel. There are just so many things that, but nonetheless, there is still the planning, there's the effort put in it to make things go as they should go. For the Jews, you remember, there was the day of preparation. The day of preparation was the day before the Sabbath. So things would be readied in advance so that the day of rest could be observed as lawfully intended. So the planning, the teaching. I know we don't have that many classes here. We have a couple, 2 or 3 classes of the younger ages, and primarily and then our auditorium class. But when we have opportunity, let's put our all into it and plan and do the very best that we possibly can. And the quality of our work, the worship, the leading and the being led, that we keep our minds involved in it, our head in the game, so to speak. That we're following where even if someone doesn't make an application on Scripture, I can make it to myself. I can think ahead about a particular word and use that to myself. And you can do the same. And that's the quality of our work. And then the carefulness that we put in, the so-called perfection, that I want something, and I believe you do too. I want something to be perfect. I don't want there to be a mistake. Go back on that little article I tried to write. I felt like I had a few mistakes that were unworthy of the Lord's service. I wanted to redo that thing. And I feel that way about if it's a sermon. I always, after I get through, I think, I needed to tweak this and here and there, and I maybe need to leave out a point. I always feel like there's room for improvement. But I believe that's what the Lord expects, that we are to, as Paul said, leaving the things that are behind and pressing on to the things that are before. That we're striving always to get better in what we do. The carefulness in what we strive to do. And then do we see matters through to their finish? If we are working on a job somewhere, and we're being paid for what we do, and then our supervisor intends for us to finish doing what we're supposed to do. Same with spiritual matters. If there's something that needs to be done, there's a person that we need to contact, there's something, we need to see it through to the very best of our ability. Communicate is so big. I've been really disappointed in the last several years, especially with young people who are lacking simple communication skills, it seems like. They are so wed to their phones, and it's like they have no clue of how you just face to face with someone. But seeing something through, communicating the ideas, seeing I'm interested in you, and I want to see you saved, and I want for you to go to heaven, and I want to go to heaven. So when we put all that together, what we do with our money, what we do with our resources, what we do with our time, which really adds up to what we're doing with our life, will determine now where we spend eternity in the hereafter. And I believe that parable of the unjust steward teaches that in no uncertain terms. You've listened carefully, and I appreciate that very much, and hope our thoughts have been helpful tonight as we think about this parable and the parallels that are made here concerning the use of material gain, the unrighteous mammon, and how it applies to the spiritual. If we can help you obey the gospel, if you haven't, or something amiss in life that needs to be corrected, come to the front as together we stand, and we'll try to help. Let's stand and sing.